try to stay with me on this. I realize this is the third time that I've actually done this presentation for Rotary Club. But the interesting thing about my topic here, which is demographics, is that it never stays the same. It's always changing. And so what I said 11 years ago isn't the same as it is now, and I'm going to highlight some of those differences. So I've got a packet for each of you, so you don't get entirely bored and you can follow along perhaps. We ran short. I didn't know there'd be this many of you, so I hope you'll share if you don't have one in front of you. If you have one and you don't want to use it, hand it to somebody who looks like they're marginally interested. So I start off on the first page with the great statement by Mao Zedong. This is about the only time I would ever quote him, that demography is destiny. And there was a lot of truth to that throughout history. Those countries and movements that have a strong demographic base are the ones that succeed and are powerful. That was true of China in Mao's day. It is no longer true, as we'll see, of China. And the other countries in the world that we'll get to talk about in here are having this problem. As I analyze this, on page 2, I wrote a number. 2.1, that is the most important number in modern demographics. That is the number of children per family that are necessary for a country or community to achieve population stability, not increase or decrease, stability. If you are above that number, your population is increasing. If you are below that number, your population is decreasing. It's arithmetic. And this is the number we'll refer to throughout this little talk. 2.1. The next page, page 3, I've got a 3A. That initial curve there is the global fertility rate. You will notice a distinct property of that rate. It has collapsed, absolutely fallen down through the roof into negative territory. The world's population growth has come to a halt. The world is not having babies. There was a time when you could say, oh, the Swedes aren't having babies, or the Norwegians. It is now everyone in the world, the poor, the rich, the Muslims, the Christians, the atheists, the South Americans, the East Asians. It is everyone, everywhere, all at the same moment in time. The next page I've got is an article that supports that. If you go on the internet and you look up these articles, there's no shortage of them, but somehow they haven't gotten into the modern dialogue.
I hate to interrupt you so early.
Go ahead.
So,
no, you don't.
3A.
3A.
Population. Is that live births?
Is it live births
I'm
as
just
opposed
saying.
to what, stillbirths?
So what do they use to populate that graph?
Okay, it's not, there you go. There's a lot of statistical stuff and definitional things that are important here. And they're talking with a fertility rate, they're trying to take an aggregate across larger communities of the number of children. So I would assume it's live births that survive.
Okay.
And not stillbirths and that sort of thing. But that does back into a concept of, how long do people live, which is another important component to this. There's some articles on this. You can find these articles almost everywhere, but you got to look for them. The modern narrative is we have too many people, population growing too fast, it's bad for the carbon footprint and the blah, 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 and all that kind of thing, and it's just not true. And anywhere you check the data, everywhere that you check the data, it is not true. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I have this kind of nerdish fascination with this topic. It is countercultural. It's against the prevailing narrative. You can't find any data to support the idea that the population in the world is growing too fast. That data does not exist. It is quite the reverse. 3B. Actually, in graphic form, you can see the global population charts and its declination. It's falling, and it's for reasons that seem to be different for each human being. I have found no article or thing that defines a unifying reason why this is happening now everywhere. For rich people in the United States, they're having too much fun. For the middle class people in the United States, things are too expensive. For the poor people in the United States, frankly, we've seen some things, they're just not having children for a variety of different reasons. The next one, page 4, is the UN population projections. They're high, medium, and low variant, kind of self-explanatory. When I talked to the Rotary Club there 11 years ago, the medium variant looked like the one that everything was going to be going to. The population trends that I talked about 11 years ago have accelerated. We are closer to the lower variant than the medium variant. One of the difficulties, as Phil was pointing out, is where do you get your information from and how confident in it are you? This is the United Nations data. I do not trust the United Nations. I think they are in it for the political reasons that everybody sees, and their data is skewed as such. But they are one of the only places you can get global data. The other place you can get it from is the World Bank. Don't necessarily trust them either. And the CIA. Don't really trust them. But you go to these different ones, and how do you like the CDC? The CDC, yeah, right. So I become skeptical of all these people, especially now that there's actually an issue afoot. Many of them are going back and revising their data to fit their narrative. So you have to go by their historical data as necessarily their new data. That's page 4. Page 5. So then we come to some specifics, right? I've shown you stuff that's going on globally. Page 5 is one of my favorites because it's Russia, right? When I wanted to make this discussion, Russia was lower down on my list because they're doing the things that they're doing. I put them here. If you look at this site, if you go there, is a real-time site. The numbers change as you watch. Number of births, number of deaths, aggregate numbers. The Russians, on this data from July 1 to now, have births and deaths. I had my secretary type out the arithmetic there. The Russians have lost, in the last 10 months, 711,000 people. That's just on their demographics. That's not because the Ukrainians bombed them, or not because of, this is pre-COVID data, not because of anything else other than what they have done to themselves. They just stopped having babies. If you extrapolate that over 12 months, that means every 12 months, and 11 years ago this number was much lower. It's 854,000 people. They are losing almost 1 million people a year. As I wrote down here, the United States of America lost 660,000 people in all of World War II. They are having a World War II level event in their country every year without a bullet being fired. Good. And you know what? I come from an age when we used to hide under our desks in grammar school because of the nuclear bombs that might go off. Not that that would have helped us, but I remember Russia in a different light. And I have that reaction. They're going out of business. But there's some very interesting articles out there about getting into Vladimir Putin's head would be impossible, right? But among the reasons they articulate for them going to Crimea and Ukraine is the fact that they are losing people faster and faster. These charts that you saw tend to be a bell curve. So once you go over the top and you start coming down the other side, you go down slowly and then at an accelerating rate. The Russians and some other people are so far down the bell curve now that they can't stop it. You know, and we'll get into China. You could stop people from having babies, you could give them abortions, you could sterilize them. Making people have babies, much harder. Much harder. So once you begin to come down this curve, you can't stop it as a government.
So just want to add in, like Russia, so in Europe they have the highest amount of HIV and abortions. So it's like increasing their death rate by a lot and then decreasing the birth by a lot. Just want to add that in.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. You know, the abortion thing is interesting in modern political debate, right? 50% of all abortions in the United States, 50% of the black births in the United States end in abortion. Right? So it is not unfair to say that the black population of the United States of America would be twice as large as it is today, but for Roe versus Wade. And that's true in a lot of countries. Sweden, Poland, the abortion availability is a direct contributor, but not the only contributor, because there are countries that we'll see in this that don't have access to any abortion rights, and they have the same demographic curve. So there's Russia. The next one,
Middle East.
Middle East. I have a whole section on the Middle East.
Okay, I'm listening. Stay tuned.
So I'll break my agenda. In the last 30 years, the Muslim world has had the largest fertility rate collapse on the globe. The Muslims are not reproducing, and they are doing so at a rate that is outstripping everyone else. They have collapsed. They are not having any children. It's a fascinating subject. There's a lot of data on it. The next one shows the curve on the Russians. You can see how low it is. It's interesting. I stuck that one in there because they show the Ukraine just down underneath it. The Ukrainians have an even lower fertility rate than the Russians. The Eastern Europeans, like the Romanians and stuff, the Eastern Europeans are some of the least fertile communities in the entire world. But that's not more than page 6A, the Japanese. The Japanese were the first country to go into absolute population decline. They are further down the demographic curve than anybody else.
I have a question.
Yes,
You say least fertile. Do you mean not having babies?
not having babies.
Well, when you say least fertile, that makes it seem like they can't.
Well, so fertility, and you hear into the definitional thing is, right? Fertility can be restricted by election. It can be restricted. Now, there are some people who would argue that the stuff that's being put into our food system, the things that we plant with, the pesticides that we use, that's one thing that goes global. And at the same time that these global pesticides have been applied across the spectrum, the fertility rates
I
decline.
have another question. Well, couldn't you argue, because now the top ones that you're saying are also places that have been dealing with war pretty regularly. So wouldn't you say that maybe that could be a huge factor?
Let's look at Japan for just exactly what you're talking about. The Japanese fertility rate didn't start to decline until well after World War II. It remained high during the fire bombings, during the atomic bombings, and it wasn't until after the war that it collapsed. There's actually a graph on that. And today, the Japanese, with a smaller population, are losing almost as many people per year as the Russians, 754,000. Again, more than the Americans lost in all of World War II, every single year. The Japanese, you can see their curve there on the other side. To Irana's point, the Japanese have had a very passive life under the American umbrella. No wars, no nothing, and you can see a pretty steady decline. The Japanese fertility rate for the Japanese in particular, it seems to be elective. They're going, not only are they going out of business there, but the next page, I start this one here for no good reason. There are so few people getting married now that people are just holding marriages by themselves, just for fun. If it wasn't so pathetic, it would be funny. I included it there because I thought it was kind of funny. I have an odd sense of humor. On the next page, 6D, the Japanese, with all their mathematics and their algorithms, they have figured the exact year in which there will be no more Japanese. They are so racist in their island, they will not allow immigrants. They are the master race. That's what World War II was all about. That's why they palled up with the Nazis. And they have figured out the exact year in which there will be no more Japanese, 2,500. I'd like to seize on that for a moment. 2,500 too. Yeah, 2,500. 500 years from now is a very tricky thing to be trying to extrapolate out, because you take a small change in these numbers and you get enormous fluctuation. Nevertheless, this is generated by the Japanese. They know what's happening to them. They know they're going out of business. There's some interesting articles about them trying to create, this is the sci-fi nerd in me coming out, trying to create babies without needing people. I mean, that's one explanation to take care of this thing. If people aren't going to have people, and assuming you don't want to go extinct, then you got to make people, right? This is like the Matrix. You got to go throw props and regenerate your people some other way. I threw this one because I thought it was an interesting concept. The next page are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Okay? Death, war, pestilence, famine. The demographic contractions that we see now globally used to happen every now and again in a country or a region during the Black Death. The Black Death took like a third of everyone in Europe, that kind of thing. There's no reason like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for what's going on right now in every country in the world. So I suggest perhaps there should be a 5th horseman of the apocalypse, demography. I put him in there with the other ones because the 5th horseman of the apocalypse works quietly, silently, slowly, glacially, maybe even tectonically. Maybe glacially is too fast. And it's as though he gets into all of our heads. You know, my parents had many more children than I did. I made an election. I've got 3. Well, why didn't I have 8? Right? How come I made that decision? Yeah, right. How come Dad didn't have 8? But we all made these decisions all across the globe. Everybody for different reasons. How did that happen? Yeah, why didn't I have it?
Well, I have another question.
Yes.
Hasn't the cost of life gone up?
Haven't the cost of life gone up?
So does that make it harder to have babies?
It's an interesting question. When we get into Afghanistan, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Uganda, and all these other countries where the cost of life has not gone up, we have the same graphs.
Yeah, but life
Education.
Education too. Look, like I said, there's no I haven't seen a compelling written article about one reason, one overarching reason. For certain people, it's education. For certain people, it's women's rights. For certain people, it's profession. For other people, it's religious. And I haven't seen a single. What's odd is that it's all happening at the same time, which is right now. I think it's a good singular reason for somebody to make that decision. The next page I got China. This whole talk was going to be about China, because I deem China to be the primary adversary of the United States in the world today. You can see from the graph on page 7A that the Chinese had a large dip, a very steep decline early on in this thing. The Chinese, throughout all of human history, have been the most populous country in the world. They have, this year or last year, India passed them. No fanfare, nothing in the newspaper, nothing on television. India is now the largest country in the world, not China. And you can see it's just a straight reflection of their demographic curve. So a lot of people always say, oh, that was their one-child policy. On the next page, I generated the China demographic curve with the superimposition of the implementation of the one-child policy. You see the bizarre thing that happened? The fertility curve had already collapsed by the time they implemented their one-child policy. When they implemented it, it flattened off and rose at rates far higher than one child. It's subsequently then declining. But the data is contrary to the entire public perception and the public narrative. The one-child policy, by the data, this is their data, by the way, which I don't really trust, but this is their data. Their data indicates the one-child policy had zero impact. In fact, it had a reverse impact on the fertility of their people. Does that not run counter to everything you've ever heard? And there's their data. Not that I trust the companies. The next page is interesting. Yeah.
Who do you trust?
You know, I trust my own eyes and ears. When I go out and do my own research and I find a half a dozen different articles, and some say one thing and some say another and some say something in between, and I synthesize it, I trust my own brain. I don't really trust much of anybody. That's why I'm giving you guys a lot of raw data. And I know Tad has a hard time reading, but if you want to read this stuff or search it on the internet, you want to do that. That's one of the reasons I created these packets, so that if it struck you like it strikes me, you can go out and check what I'm doing or do your own research. Just because I'm saying it and I'm pointing to something doesn't make it right, to Tad's point. The next article is very interesting. The Chinese did a census in 2020, okay, during the COVID. And they were the first people to come out with data that is reflective of the COVID. And there's anecdotal evidence the COVID had a catastrophic effect on already low fertility rates for, I think, reasons we can all understand. So in China, as bad as their fertility rate was, it went down by almost 30% during the COVID. Remember 2.1? Well, using the Chinese, their own data, their fertility rate is now 1.3. That means when demographers talk about generations, they call them cohorts. And they last about 20 years. We call them Gen X and Gen Y and Gen Z, but it's a 20-year swath of the population, and they call it a cohort. With a 1.3 fertility rate, that means each cohort, each generation, is 1/3 smaller than the generation before it. Think about the bell curve and what that means for the Chinese now. They're about to drop off the back end of that bell curve at a rate that is historically unprecedented and is without known cure. 1.3. This is the Chinese data. It's interesting. I Googled up the guy who's in charge of the census and came up and distributed this information. He's now been reassigned. He's no longer the head of their census department. I fully expect them to revise this data. But it's interesting, before they were able to revise it, somebody sent it out to the world, kind of like a draft opinion of the Supreme Court, and there it is. Everybody can look at it now and know what's coming.
So I just want to throw in that, so China has like zero social security kind of stuff. So they're facing this like issue of like if the population that's older and like a lot more populous is going to have like no security net as they get older and they're screwed. So
that's the outstanding point. It's almost highlighted in the next page, 7D. As bad as this whole thing is for the United States of America, and maybe other countries, for the Chinese, it's terrible because they have no social security, there's no social network. As the old people get old and there are no new people to take care of them, what do? What happens to their economy? Their workforce has been, when I gave my first presentation to the Buffalo Republic, that was the first year the Chinese workforce contracted, which was big news. They've been contracting now for 11 years. And the labor shortages are now replete all over the country. This article, which is by I get these bizarre things, you know. I'd like to go outside the United States because the United States doesn't report well and doesn't report without trying to impose their narrative on it. It's usually from the South China News or something else. The Chinese population is going to drop by 50% by the end of this decade. 50%. Remember I talked about the Black Plague took out a third of all of Europe? This is going to take out 50% of the Chinese population before this century is out. And that's just an arithmetic extrapolation. There's nothing they can do about it. That fifth horseman of the apocalypse I was joking about, it's arrived. It's here. It's manifesting itself in Japan, China, and Russia as we speak. And I'm going to suggest by the end of this that it's manifesting itself everywhere. So the Chinese are in deep trouble. Now
And that's even highlighted even more about on the next page where there's a 20 to 24%, no, a 64% population decline from age 20 to 24. So those are the people
Those are the
that are
workers.
supposed to be, but then also are going to be taking care of the older
Old
people, and they don't have the ability.
The
to
next
do
page
that.
is really interesting, not just for the discussion that's being done there, but for that chart. That chart, you get rid of the old coots. But that would cause your population to decline even faster. So this has a population change for the 10 most populous countries in the world, and you can see the calamity that's facing almost every one of them. 48% for China, 21% for India. India has now passed China, but they're coming to the top of their curve as well. And the Indian population is going to be dropping up because their fertility rates have collapsed as well. Look at the United States, number 3. Right? For a guy who liked Donald Trump, I can tell you there's only one reason why that number is what it is. And that's because half of all the immigration in the world ends up in the United States of America. The world is going to fall, demographically speaking, and assuming that we can have the social cohesion to hold our country together, the world is going to fall into America's lap if we just don't blow this thing. That's what a lot of this data says, and that's one of the reasons why I find it so interesting. Look at these declination rates. Everybody across the board, even Brazil. I always thought, oh, Brazilians, they're at,
I thought there was Brazilian people there.
So, I would note for you Nigeria. Nigeria has a very interesting thing going on, and their population is set to triple, according to the data. I'm not sure that they're going to be able to pull that up, but if they do, they will have the largest population in the world also by the end of this century. So if you're going to be looking at, in the next 20 to 30 years, the Indian population, their demographic dividend is going to power them to the front row. The next page gets into the India thing, right? Into the front row of economic superpowers in the world. And that's just going to be a matter of the size of their workforce and the number of their old people. The number of their old people is extremely small because they haven't lived long, and the number of their workers is enormous, and they're just hitting the workforce now. If I was to say you want to invest someplace for the next 30 years, do it in India. Because it's like shooting fish in a barrel. They are going to be America's competitor, hopefully our ally. And this said, according to the UN 2022, India overtook China. Since the Chinese have fought off the UN, I suspect it's already happened. Not that I'm cynical about either of these. And, yeah, so then I stuck in the fertility rate for India, right? Because everybody can tell the Indians are having so many people on page 7E. You can see the Indian fertility rate graph is the same as everybody else. It has collapsed and continues on that downtrend. It's not like these things are hooking back up. And you just got the same problem as you saw on that other chart. Somewhere around 2060, 2070, their population tops out and then begins to decline at an accelerating rate. I threw in Taiwan here because if you look at the next page, Taiwan has a fertility rate of 1.07. That means every cohort is 60% smaller than the cohort before. Taiwan is going down the demographic curve even faster than Japan. I would note that if you put these things together, like what's happening in Taiwan and China, China's economy has gotten very large, but their population is about to drop off just the way the Japanese and Russians did. If you've seen what happened, just in our lifetime, when I was growing up in college, the Japanese were going to take over the world. They were buying everything. How about today? You never hear about it. The Japanese population started contracting and their world power collapsed. That's about to happen to the Chinese. And the Chinese can see it in the Russians and the Japanese. There's a lot of data out there. The Soviet Union collapsed because of demographic collapse. The Chinese moment in time to establish the world hegemony that they want is right now. The demography instability for that country is the same thing that affected Russia and caused them to go into the Crimea and Ukraine, among the reasons. And I suggest that now is the moment in time when China has to make their move. You can see it in the South China Sea, where they've weaponized all those small islands there. They're making the moves toward Taiwan now. I even stuck in an article here where, we'll get to it, where the Japanese have recognized the threat. For the first time, the Japanese are amending their constitution to ramp up for the Chinese invasion of Okinawa, which is the next island over from Taiwan. I threw in the thing on 7H about 3 children. You may have heard, when I gave my first presentation to Rotary, the Chinese that year repealed the one-child policy and said you could have 2 children. As you can tell from that demographic curve thing that I printed, it did absolutely no. People weren't having 1 child, they weren't going to have 2 because some bureaucrats said they could. Last year, they increased, it was the year before, they increased it to 3 children. Okay, you can have 3 children. And it had absolutely no impact on their births. So the authorities, certain reporters who are thinking, not the ones in the United States, have gone to the Chinese authorities and said, well, why cap it at 3? Right? Why not just take it off and say you can do whatever you want? And the reason is the racism rampant in China. Because the only populations in China that actually have 2 and 3 children per family are in Tibet or the Uyghurs. And they don't want the Tibetans and Uyghurs overwhelming their country. They want the Han Chinese to be having these children. So they capped it at 3 because they know that that doesn't affect the Chinese. That affects all the other minorities inside of their country. It's an interesting footnote on the Chinese and their problem and their internal hatreds. You can hunt it down through the article there. That's actually the New York Times. Sometimes not often. Geez, I give the New York Times 3 pages. That's a mistake. Stop buying the New York Times is not a policy. On page 7I is the article about the Japanese recognizing the Chinese threat and amending their constitution to allow them to arm themselves so that they can do something about it when the day arrives. There's anybody who knows what Chinese are all about, it's the Japanese. They hate each other. I suggest we ally ourselves with the Japanese because the Chinese are the threat. Good article I commend to you if you're reading. Again, you have to go to the United Kingdom to get that kind of thing. Now we get into some of the other things. Some other people were asking about different parts of the world. Because I'm of a certain age, I threw in on page 8A, Vietnam. When we were in Vietnam, you can see from this curve, they were having, 6 children per family. Now it's down around 2. Same demographic curve, same collapse, the same thing as what East Asia is almost as bad as Eastern Europe. The East Asians, whether it's the Koreans or, I think I actually go into Hong Kong next. No, I go into, there goes I wanted to go. The East Asians are not having children, almost unanimous. Every country you point to, it's about the lowest in the world. I put in Iran over here because I wrote Shah in the middle of the graph on page 8B, because I remember very clearly when the Shah fell and all the ripples that went around the world on that. You can see when the Shah fell that the Iranians were having 6, 6.5, 7 children per family. Now the Iranians are down around 2. That number is up when they discovered there was a game afoot. I think those numbers have been cooked. But the Iranians, as with the rest of the Muslim world, you can see the collapse was sudden. It was really sudden and unexpected. The Iranian mullahs banned all those fertility clinics at which women used to be able to get health services and abortions because they realized what was happening. And Iran has a double demographic problem. Nobody's trying to get into that country. Everybody's trying to get out. So they got the double win. So they've got problems with regeneration and problems with people voting with their feet. It's interesting that they stuck Ukraine in. I don't know why they stuck Ukraine in. Turkey is the next one. You see the same thing. The Turks are not having children. There was a time when everybody thought, oh, the Turks are going to overrun Germany and Sweden and Denmark. No, they are not. They're doing the same thing. And again, they got the double problem. Everybody's trying to get out, nobody's trying to get in. So the Muslim world has the same problem, but it's been packed into the last 3 decades, where it took Britain and France and the United States 100 years to adjust its fertility. These people did it in 30. And as was being said here, none of them have a social safety nets available so that when the population ages out and there's no more young people to pay for them, there's no safety net. And they don't have the wealth to provide it coming out of nowhere. I threw in some of my favorites like Italy. The Italians like to have children, right? Look at page 8D. 1.27. lower than even the Chinese.
Look at their life expectancy though.
Well, the life expectancy, but you can see how long that number's been down. The life expectancy will grow your population for a while, but they've been down at these numbers since the 1970s. So 40, 50 years later, your life expectancy doesn't save you from a number like that. That means that every cohort is about 40% smaller than the cohort before it. There will be no Italians before there are no Japanese.
No.
Yeah, I'm telling you. The next one is Spain. Spain's even worse than the Italians. So you think Spain would be one of these countries where, no. In fact, there's some interesting articles out there. In the northwest of Spain, there's an urbanization thing going on as well. The whole area is depopulated. They got no people. Not fewer people, they got no people. And the Spanish government will give you land if you show up there and say, I will live on the land. The problem is there's no gas stations, there's no grocery stores, the roads are falling, there's no roads. What would you do? You would have to be a pioneer. You would have to be a pioneer, but you get the land for nothing. They'll give it to you if you go, if you live there. Spain's got the worst problem than some of these other folks. Next one's Sweden. I threw it in here. Everybody says, well, the Swedes, the Swedes are in pretty good shape actually compared to everybody else. The numbers I've been throwing around, Sweden's at 1.7. So right, that's about 20-25% less per cohort. It gives you a little time to adjust some things. The Swedes are pretty racist too. They won't let anybody move into their country. I think when their population begins declining at an accelerated rate, they may rethink that. But as of right now, if you wanted to move to Sweden permanently, you can't. You can't.
Really?
They closed their borders in the 1970s, as in all the Nordic countries. Norway, they show Finland. Finland's at 1.35. They didn't rethink it. Their social security net was so generous that everybody was coming there for that reason. And they said, that's enough. That's enough. You can't come. You can visit. I'm happy to have you visit. But you got to leave. I threw in Mexico too because we had some discussions here about modern American politics. Mexicans, same deal. Same deal. And there's some interesting data now on the Mexicans. The Mexicans have gotten a reverse immigration flow from the United States now. There are fewer people entering the United States and more of them going home. Mexico, same problem.
When you mentioned Iran and Turkey as a Muslim country,
Yeah.
but you didn't go to the Middle East like Egypt, Sudan, Saudi Arabia.
Egypt and Saudi Arabia have the same thing. Sudan is more Shahil. I'll get into the Shahil in a minute.
Have the same thing as what? Decline?
Has the same kind of declines. Morocco, Lebanon, Tunisia, Algeria, it's all the same. These are indicative. These are not outliers.
Egypt declining?
Egypt too. Egypt's in a steep decline. Egypt hasn't come down. I think Egypt may still be at like 2.8. Egypt's got the same collapse.
No, but you're talking the fertility rate, not necessarily just gross population.
The gross population tends to follow the fertility rate by 40 to 60 years. So if your fertility rate collapses now and stays down for 30 years, you'll see
But a
that.
lot of these countries you're talking about in the last year or two or three or four has actually had a population increase. I mean, you're focusing on the fertility rate,
That's right.
not just the population growth.
That's exactly right.
How the population can increase without fertility?
Exactly. So he's right. You're right. You're both right.
Take over countries.
You're both right. And there's, like I said, there's an echo effect. Right? The Japanese population stopped growing about 60 years ago. It didn't start declining until about 30 years ago. There's a lag time. But you can see it to an arithmetic certainty. When you stop having babies, your population will continue to expand for a while, but it's just arithmetic. Eventually there aren't as many mothers, and mothers are the key, that the population is going to decline like night follows day.
Given all of this, what should our policy be with regard to immigration?
So, skip, that gets to the last one, so let's just skip to the next one really quick. I've got here on 9A, Nigeria. I call that the Sub-Saharan Africa. You'll see their numbers are very much higher. When I spoke 11 years ago, they were still rising. 11 years ago, I could say that 97% of the countries in the world have a falling fertility rate, but there were several that didn't. As we sit here today, I did a search before this. I can't find any country in the world, not one, not even Israel, that has a rising fertility rate. At this point, 100% of the countries in the world have a declining fertility rate, including Nigeria, Niger, Ghana. They're coming down from very much higher rates, 5 and 6 children, and they're just starting down the curve. So too with Ethiopia. Oh, here's Egypt, by the way. On page 9b, Egypt's at 3.28. You can see the outlines of their curve. And it's just a matter of time before the Egyptians suffer the same. If you call it suffer, other people would say it's a good thing. So what should be our policy on immigration? On the last page, I put immigration in there. Oh, I don't have it on mine. All right. Not bad. All right. So 50% of the gross immigration in the world winds up in the United States. And our demographic curve is solid. It's growing slowly because the United States is letting in almost 1 million people a year legally. I would draw a distinction because of the political polarization around illegal immigration. Even during the Trump years, America took in 1 million immigrants a year legally. And so the legal immigration, I don't think is really on the table for too many people. My recommendation on this, if you believe Mao Zedong that demography is destiny, and the Americans have a fertility rate of 1.7, you got to fill the gap. People want to come to this country for reasons that we could debate with some gusto, I'm going to guess, but they want to come here. I suggest we let them do so. Now, it seems incumbent on those of us who are here to assimilate them. You know, France has a large immigrant population, but they put them into ghettos. And they don't let them work, and they don't let them move outside their ghettos, and so they become virtually colonies. The Algerians, the old French Empire, they can move to France, but they can't disperse. So they have these whole areas, the no-enter zones, where virtually the immigrants are running their own show. For France, with the drop-off in the native population and these immigrant colonies growing, that's a problem. Germany's got the same problem. So if you're going to have immigration and they assimilate, it's a great thing. That's the American experience. You assimilate them, right? When my Irish ancestors came here, the English were horrified. When my Irish ancestors saw those Italians, they were horrified. But each time, after a couple of generations, they become Americans. And that has been the strength of the American experiment. If the fifth horseman of the apocalypse is going to continue doing what I think he's doing, in the short term, America benefits. In the medium term, America benefits. In the long term, you can't keep importing people if every country in the world is losing people. I don't know what the long-term solution is for anybody, except maybe the Japanese to grow people. But for America, it seems clear to me, you want to stay in a great power race, you're going to need to replenish those people who are not here. And the only way to do that is immigration. That remains thoughts. Anybody have any? Did I bore you sufficiently?
Very.
Okay.